Protect has spent much of the last year looking at whistleblowing in the context of the environment, and I'm delighted to hand over to our chair, Schona Jolly KC, and our panel on speaking up about climate change and the launch of Protect's new toolkit for whistleblowers. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and see lots of familiar faces and some less familiar faces. There's a great mix of lawyers, activists, journalists and various other people. And I hope this panel will very much bring some of that together. Every week there's been a new piece of alarming news on the climate. This morning the news was that scientists are so stunned by the planet's record September heat that they've called it gobsmackingly bananas. And another UN report this morning records that countries are still, unsurprisingly, way off track to meet the goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement just weeks before the next meeting. And much, much more action is needed to make it possible to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that's the kind of news that we wake up to every day, every week. So it's hardly surprising that the climate emergency and environmental consciousness are increasing amongst the public and also amongst the workforce. Evidence suggests that the younger generations coming into workforces increasingly place climate and environmental issues at the very centre of their concerns. And from an employment perspective, that translates into multiple different areas in which the climate affects employers. Employees are concerned about their employers' attitudes and their approaches. That might find itself reflected in policies. It might find there may be a whistleblowing policy which specifically reflects environmentalism, for example. It may even affect employment contracts. And vice versa, employers might be concerned about climate issues that affect their employees, either reputationally or internally. So, for example, social media, environmental protest, disruption, etc. All of these have got the potential to impact on a workforce. And employers, of course, are also beginning to face far more scrutiny from shareholders, from investors on ESG matters, and also from regulators, including on what has become known as greenwashing, which we're going to hear a little bit more about today. That is, for those who don't know, companies who make false or misleading statements about their environmental credentials. The panel today is very specifically concerned with the unique challenges of environmental whistleblowing. Thinking back to some of the big disasters of our time, it is employees who tend to be the early warning signal. It is employees who need to be the early warning signal because members of the public on whom these sort of issues will impact often simply don't know. And they find out far too late about practices where employees could have blown the whistle. How can we help environmental whistleblowers speak up more safely? Of course, today's not the time for me to give you a lecture about the technicalities of employment law, but it's worth noting that the PEDA legislation as found in the ERA has a very specific broad category of environmental harm. And until now, it's been mostly used for environmental mispractice. There's actually quite few cases comparatively, and it's generally considered for sort of wider issues like pollution, etc. And there's certainly, I think, a very real possibility that it will begin to be used in a much more narrow, concrete way. So employees thinking about environmental whistleblowing, not necessarily just in the widest possible way, but also in a more narrow way relating to employees' concerns about recycling or supply chains or even business travel. And of course, there are other categories which are protected within the Employment Rights Act, criminal offences or legal obligations. And as, notwithstanding what we heard from our Prime Minister last week, I think almost inevitably we will see increased laws and increased regulations. Again, notwithstanding what we heard last week. And what that means is that the scope for environmental whistleblowing is likely to grow and grow. So today we want to think about the role whistleblowers play in the fight against environmental damage. How might speaking up actually affect the climate emergency? May it help address it? Are there issues that are very specific to environmental whistleblowing? What does the international landscape look like? For all these questions, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our excellent speakers today. We have Desiree Fixler, an ESG expert and whistleblower. Desiree became the first head of sustainability at Deutsche Bank's asset management arm in June 2020. But she was fired less than a year later after raising important greenwashing concerns. Her actions sparked an internal investigation at the firm and then greenwashing probes by both German and US regulators, which are ongoing. Natalie Prosser, I'm delighted to introduce her. She's the CEO of the newest environmental regulator in the UK, the Office of Environmental Protection. It was created in November 21 under the Environment Act 2021, and I think was prescribed in 2022, November 2022. If you don't know what prescribed means, effectively it's a category of organisation outside of the employer to whom employees and workers can go to report whistleblowing and wrongdoing. And the mission of the OEP is to protect and improve the environment by holding government and other public authorities to account, no less. Which makes me think a little bit about the story we've just heard about Josie Stewart in a different context. We also have Gabriel Bourdon-Fattal, who's the co-founder and co-director of Climate Whistleblowers, an NGO that aims to protect individuals who expose wrongdoings that worsen the climate crisis and help them have a greater impact. Gabriel was previously director of programs at the Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa and has worked on environmental justice issues in the Middle East. And finally, last but not least, Caitlín Comins is a legal officer at Protect. She spearheaded the charity's Environmental Whistleblowing Project, which culminates in the launch today, if you haven't seen it, and I think there is a QR code in the pamphlets that you've all got, of Protect's Environmental Toolkit, which is a comprehensive practical and legal guide. I believe it's about 80 pages long, to raising environmental concerns safely and effectively. So with that, I'm going to turn immediately to Caitlín and ask, why did Protect create an environmental whistleblowing toolkit, and what do you hope to achieve with it?
Very good question. So we're delighted to be launching it today. So the toolkit, as you've said, is a legal and practical guide to help workers speak up to raise environmental concerns. We have drafted it with the assistance of trade unions, lawyers, NGOs, journalists, and all of the team at Protect. It aims to help workers understand their rights to raise environmental concerns and to help them raise their concerns safely and effectively. Now, the reason we started it hits on a lot of the points that actually you've just mentioned, which is that as individual workers, we found ourselves concerned about the environment and the climate, and barely a day goes by, as you've mentioned, where we don't see it in the press. And that's really a theme that is reflected across UK workplaces. So the ONS last year did a survey that showed 3/4 of adults in Great Britain are worried about the climate crisis. But what felt bizarre was when we started to look to our own advice line that receives around 2,500 to 3,000 calls from whistleblowers a year, and we found only 6 of those calls last year, just 1% related to environmental issues. And then when we started to look to the environmental regulators, and particularly the key environmental regulators for Great Britain, so Natural Resources Wales, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and the Environment Agency in England, we found that they were similarly receiving very few whistleblowing disclosures. They received 38, between the three of them, 38 disclosures last year. Now that's in comparison to hundreds and thousands of other regulators. We've heard from the CAA earlier today who received hundreds in 1 year. So looking at this, it felt that something's just really not adding up. It seems that workers are not using whistleblowing processes to raise environmental concerns. And that really doesn't seem to tie in with the level of social concern or awareness for environmental issues. So that's why in drafting the toolkit, we decided we needed to do some research to try and understand this better. So we conducted a YouGov survey. We obviously looked to our advice line, and our 30 years of experience of working with whistleblowers, we pooled a network of experts who were able to help us understand more about environmental issues. And we also reached out to relevant regulators, and that's helped us glean a little bit of information and to have a think about why some of those stats might be so low. So we can see those on the board now. So why are we seeing so few environmental whistleblowers? Well, we think there's potentially sort of 3 key issues, and the guide looks to address those. So one, it seems to be there's a real lack of awareness. So only 36% of workers, so just over a third of workers in the UK reported that they knew about their right to raise environmental concerns and be protected under whistleblowing law. It also seems worryingly that a fear of victimisation or a fear of reprisal is putting off a lot of workers from raising those concerns. So when we've looked to our own advice line, we found that over the past 10 years, the number of the environmental whistleblowers who contacted us, 74% were treated negatively as a result of raising those concerns. And finally, it seems that not only are workers being victimised for raising environmental concerns, but a lot of the time they also seem to be ignored. So our YouGov survey found that 33% of workers raising environmental concerns found those concerns were ignored when they raised them. And we really think that whistleblowers have far too important a role to play in speaking up on environmental issues for them to be ignored and victimised. So that is why the guide is designed to raise awareness and also to help workers raise concerns in a way that's going to minimise their chance of victimisation and maximise their chance of those environmental concerns being addressed. So as you said, it's very comprehensive. It is 80 pages. We don't necessarily envisage you read it front to back, although we would love it if you do. But it covers the whole whistleblowing journey, and that is a complex journey, and that is why it's such a long guide. So what we do is we start with thinking about what is an environmental concern. That can be really broad, and I'm hoping the panel's going to look at some of that when we get to them. So that could be anything from greenwashing and misrepresentation of ESG credentials to pollution or destruction of a bird's nest. Then we think practically about what do you do when you have that concern. So how, when, and where do you raise those concerns? And what are your legal protections if you do raise those concerns? So obviously as whistleblowing experts, we've covered your rights under whistleblowing law, but our team of collaborators have helped us think about when an Equality Act claim might be relevant, or indeed a tort negligence claim might be relevant as well. They've also helped us think about when other tactics, such as working with your union or lobbying your employer, may be beneficial to getting that environmental concern addressed. And finally, I mean, we've obviously woven through our 30 years of experience of working with whistleblowers throughout this guide. And as we've discussed today, one of those key and very sad sort of understandings we have from that is that the whistleblowing journey is difficult. And that's why we've included a chapter on psychological safety to help workers really think about what are the risks of whistleblowing and how can they put in place support networks and tactics to try and mitigate and manage that risk. So that is the toolkit. It's very comprehensive. We really hope it's the starting point of an ongoing bit of work. As you've seen, the stats are low. So what we want to do with this is spread it far and wide. We want to raise awareness. We want to inspire workers to speak up safely when they have environmental concerns. And fundamentally, we want to try and contribute to preventing environmental harm. And we really do think if we're going to prevent further environmental damage, we need to use all tools. Whistleblowing is one of those tools, and currently it seems to be underutilised. So please do take a look. Please scan it. There's flyers, there's a brochure. Please repost it. We'll be doing lots of comms over the next few days. Yes,
thank you very much.
Panel with us.
Thank you very much indeed. I highly recommend that you take a look at it. And we might come back later on to talk about some of the detail of that if we have a chance, but I know we're tight on time today. I'm going to turn to Natalie Prosser, as the CEO of the Office of Environmental Protection. What do you think should be the role of regulators in addressing the negative impact of businesses on the climate?
So that's a really big question. For those of you who are not familiar with us at the OEP, I thought I'd just give my little elevator pitch. We're a new body. We're not even 2 years old. We are a non-departmental public body funded by government. And as we said, our job is to protect and improve the environment. And we do that through accountability. I've loved hearing about the theme of accountability today. That's what we exist to do. We exist to hold government to account. Now, what that means is that we have, we're called a super regulator in your report, and I highly commend the Protect. I do think I need a cape now. My team would be with me on that, but we don't describe ourselves as a super regulator, but we do describe ourselves as an accountability body. And that means that we have oversight of a vast array of public and government bodies in England and Northern Ireland with responsibilities under environmental law. Now, you asked a question about climate. The environment is, of course, an ecosystem, and we think of it as an ecosystem. So we don't really differentiate between climate harm and other harms. To us, they are fundamentally interconnected. There's a biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. They're two parts of the same coin. So I'm going to talk about the environment more broadly in the round. What there is a vast array of bits of government responsible for protecting the environment in one form or another. And that is incredibly difficult for members of the public and indeed those who work within those oversight bodies, it would be those individuals who'd be protected in coming to us, to understand exactly who is responsible for what. At the OEP, we have the ability to take complaints from members of the public, and we have the ability to investigate those. And in the last 18 months, we've had something like 700 different approaches from members of the public. About 100 or so of those have turned into formal complaints. 2 of those are now live investigations, very large, substantial investigations into wrongdoing in the public sector. But for those who come to us, none of whom are whistleblowers, to my knowledge, we haven't had any whistleblowing disclosures to us so far, it is incredibly difficult for a concerned member of the public to work out who is responsible for what. That's really difficult, and we've had to invest into our frontline teams to help them work that out. And even if they can figure out who's responsible for what, knowing whether there's a law engaged, and there needs to be a law engaged for our investigation and oversight powers to kick in that particular context, that's almost impossible for most people to figure out as well, because the system is just so complex. And we have a whole range of concerns brought to us at the OEP, which might be called suboptimal practice or inefficient practice or weak practice, but it's not unlawful practice. And getting the barrier between those two things, even for an informed complainant, is really, really challenging. So, for example, if I look across the regulatory system, there is a persistent problem with under-enforcement. And that may be a reason why there are limited whistleblowing disclosures. And I know across the environmental regulators, and it comes up again and again and again, that where concerns are brought to regulators, the likelihood of that being actioned is relatively low. And that has got significantly worse over recent years. Now, there has been some more money put into, particularly into the Environment Agency in terms of what they do. But the mandate that they have and the breadth that they have is so enormous, it makes it really challenging. If I might illustrate what that looks like, you have Environment Agency and other regulators responsible for regulating water companies. They're responsible for managing waste, and waste is absolutely riddled with crime, absolutely riddled with it. They're responsible for protecting the air. They're responsible for nuclear safety. They're responsible for chemicals regulation. It is a massive, massive remit, and in every single one of those sectors, you will find risks of harm. The water sector, we have a huge investigation going on in relation to regulation of the water sector at the moment. We have 6 of our water companies subject to criminal investigation right now. And at the start of that investigation, every single one of them was under. And I'm not regulatory breaches, I'm talking criminal investigations. So I am very surprised that we don't see more whistleblowing, because it is not just the case that regulators have reasonable suspicion of a criminality. Water companies have been convicted of criminality, which says to me that there are probably significant amounts of extremely poor behaviour going on that is simply not coming to light, and if it does come to light, that it's not being dealt with.
Do you think a problem might be that employees and workforces in general just don't know what a prescribed body is and that they can come to you?
Absolutely right.
And how can that be resolved?
I think the Protect toolkit is fantastic. I think that's great. But I suspect, and I don't know this, and I'd be interested in understanding more. I think probably the biggest barrier is lack of action. One of our investigations that we've got ongoing at the moment is in Northern Ireland in relation to the Department for Agriculture in Northern Ireland. That was triggered to us not by a whistleblower but by a member of the public. A member of the public brought 8 cases to our attention of individual decisions. And we were able to review those 8 cases. And because I've got a team of investigators and lawyers who can look at that, they were able to identify a common theme through this intelligence that a member of the public brought to us. And that triggered us to launch an investigation. I don't think there are many organisations like us that have the resources or the bandwidth to do that. And even we don't have the resources and bandwidth to do that, apart from in a handful of small cases.
So if a whistleblower wanted to come to you from within their organisation to report something, how would you set about supporting them and providing them with knowledge and assistance with what they're trying to do?
It was really important for me that the OEP become a prescribed person. It was something I pushed for really early in the organisation. We've got an external-facing whistleblower policy, but any person, not just a whistleblower, but any person who's got a concern about compliance with environmental law can come in through our standard procedure. We've evolved our publicly available information to try and make this as accessible to people as they possibly can. And they can come in, they can have dialogue with us. I've got case handlers, a very small number of case handlers, and they sit down and they talk to people and they engage with them and they try and get help to them to understand what they're bringing to us. And that really helps them understand whether they've got something to bring to us. Now, we've never had a whistleblower, so it's really difficult to know exactly how we would support that. My experience with dealing with whistleblowers as a regulator for many, many years is that there is a disconnect between whistleblowing legislation and protection, which is an employment-based system to protect whistleblowers from consequences of their employers, and my concern as a regulator about serious threat and harm to the environment. And the two don't necessarily dock together. And when I've dealt with whistleblowers in former roles, they've brought intelligence into you as a regulator. It's a very difficult balancing act because sometimes the intelligence they bring to you is so serious that you want to action it, but you know full well that that risks prejudice to that whistleblower. So at the OEP, we're upfront in our policy. We might not be able to protect your identity. We might not be able to take your case, indeed, or anything like that. But our people are trained and will engage with any individual, whether they're a whistleblower or a member of the public, to help them understand the process and get that information from them. And sometimes that means that we won't take that case. That's a very real possibility. But we always listen and we always talk and we always explain our thinking to everybody, whistleblower or member of the public.
That's a really interesting point. And some of you in the audience may have experience of the situation where you have whistleblowers who want to stay anonymous for all sorts of obvious reasons. But of course that presents its own challenges, both in the employment sphere and in the regulatory sphere. There's so much more I'd love to ask you, but I'm going to move on for the purposes of time to Gabriel. Gabriel, I want to ask you very specifically about the charity that you set up and the impact that environmental whistleblowers you've worked with have had.
Sure. So we set up Climate Whistleblowers around 4 or 5 months ago, so we are still very young. But we protected many environmental whistleblowers for years before that. And we identified the same gap that you're talking about, the gap between how much the public is concerned about the environment and our little climate whistleblowers and environmental whistleblowers we have. And we also identified through our work with whistleblowers on the environment a couple of common problems, common issues with several whistleblowers. And we thought that by creating an NGO that will work specifically on climate and environmental whistleblowing, we would be able to support these whistleblowers, to support other NGOs working on the matter, and also to help them have more impact. And through that, maybe with time, to encourage others to step forward, because whistleblowers bring more whistleblowers. And we believe that international work for climate whistleblowing and environmental whistleblowing is extremely important, and I'll expand on that in a second. So why did we think that environmental whistleblowing was a specific issue and that whistleblowers on environment faced specific issues? That first of all, whistleblowers on forces behind the climate, for example, behind the climate crisis, they blow the whistle on massive forces, very strong actors, banks, billionaires, fossil fuel companies, energy companies, blowing the whistle on these companies, even if you are protected legally in theory, is extremely complicated. The second is that proving environmental damage is extremely complicated. We mostly worked before with corruption and money laundering whistleblowers, and we had a bank record. We could see money going from a public company to a private company and then to a private account. But when you lie about your emissions, when you pollute a river, where you fraud the public or bring forward a product that is green but is not actually green, many times there will be no trace of that. The only way to prove the damage would be to go to the river, sometimes far away, and to test it and to look at it for months. It takes time, it takes resources. And another issue that is crucial is that environmental crimes are often transnational. So in general, fraud and crime are often transnational because bad actors use globalization and they use different jurisdictions to fraud the public. But this is particularly true for climate and environment from what we see. Because oil companies will go pollute Uganda and they will go pollute Papua New Guinea, and carbon offsets companies will go buy lands in Zimbabwe and Liberia, like we saw recently, and others will just create very complex, big multinational systems with jurisdictions and companies and bank accounts in different places. All of that makes environmental whistleblowing essential, because these whistleblowers can prove something that is very important for the public, but also very complicated. Complicated because it's hard to prove, complicated because you need different jurisdictions to work together. Some of them can help you, some of them can't help you. Some of them are interested, some of them have resources or don't have resources. Some of them are very interested, but they cannot help whistleblowers, which creates another kind of problems. You will need journalists, but often local journalists don't have resources, or even international ones, to work for months and years on one investigation to prove environmental damage, which is extremely complicated. And very often, as we saw, and I'm going to give an example of a whistleblower we work with in just a second. We have whistleblowers, for example, in Brazil on forest, or a whistleblower in Mali on deforestation. And while what they want to blow the whistle about is relevant to all of us, because if the Amazon disappears, then we are all screwed. And many times it's relevant to us as Europeans, because they blow the whistle on tree logging and wood that will reach Europe at some point. But many times these whistleblowers on environment exist in a legal vacuum. There is no whistleblower protection in most of the countries of the world, and it's not in a vacuum, it's actually illegal, completely illegal. There's no way to even create a theory in which it is legal to steal documents from your employer and give them to a journalist. So we are trying to overcome all these issues by working with different jurisdictions, bringing them together, identifying the right actors in these jurisdictions, and making sure that they can protect the whistleblowers, and creating also a community of experts on science, on greenwashing, on fossil fuels, that we can reach out to if there is a problem with the whistleblower.
Can I ask you to tell us about Amadou Traoré, because it would be nice to put that in the context of someone who did specifically whistleblow.
Yeah, absolutely. So Amadou Traoré is from Mali. He's very talented with languages, so quite quickly Amadou started working as a translator from Mandarin to French for a Chinese logging company on the frontier between Senegal and Mali. And quite quickly Amadou noticed that there was massive illegal logging of rosewood, a very precious wood, in the frontier of Senegal and Mali. And Amadou likes forests, and he started taking photos and videos of what he saw, and he gave it to the media. The story is both positive and negative in a couple of senses, that Amadou had to run away. There is no whistleblower protection in Mali. He had to flee to find refuge in another country. His family stayed behind, so he did not see his family, his kids, for years, which is extremely complicated. But on the other end, we supported Amadou for years. We brought journalists from Senegal and international journalists, and we brought some funding as well, so they could investigate the matter for a couple of years. We gave him some funds so he can leave while he helps them elaborate their investigations, and this resulted in a massive investigation on rosewood logging. And actually there is now a ban not only because of Amadou, but also because of Amadou in 16 West African countries on whistleblowing, which is quite remarkable.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I just want to think for a moment for an audience that I assume is largely UK-based. I just want to think about the point on jurisdiction which you raised, because many of you will know that it doesn't necessarily matter where the environmental harm is that an employee, for the purposes of the Employment Rights Act, is alleging has taken place. That doesn't matter. But the jurisdiction of where that employee is based may matter. And so there are ways here, obviously, of protecting whistleblowers who are blowing the whistle on harm that's taken place abroad, but there needs to be a connection. And where there isn't a connection in Britain with a British employer, some of us are now looking at quite interesting ways to think about how you can use other forms of, or other jurisdiction, or other forms of law, torts of negligence, for example, to use the British courts to nevertheless bring those claims for whistleblowing. So there is lots to think about, and we at least have some of the infrastructure here that can allow us to start to overcome those, whereas obviously in some of the countries in which you're working, as you say, there simply isn't the infrastructure at all. So with that thought about the international impact of whistleblowing, I'd like to turn to Desiree Fixler. And perhaps you could start by telling the audience what was the wrongdoing that you blew the whistle on, and how did you do it?
So I was working in Germany, and Germany only recently adopted the whistleblower EU directive. It was very reluctant to do that. So I actually worked in a country without whistleblower protection. So I was the chief sustainability officer at Deutsche Bank's asset manager. I reported directly to the CEO. I was hired because the CEO wanted to make ESG a priority. He was making statements, ESG is in our corporate DNA, it's at the heart of everything we do. He clocked that there was an ESG investing boom. So he was doing this, and it's a for-profit company, right? There's nothing wrong with this. He was doing it because he saw it as a great growth opportunity to make a lot of money. The problem is how he went about it, and his little underlings, and the lame duck board that just watched it happen. So basically, he decided this would be a great scheme to ride up the share price, and let's fake it until we have a stronger currency to buy another asset manager that knows what it's doing. So he just went out there, and the firm went out there with just misleading statements to the market that the company was advanced, was a leader in ESG. It had sophisticated, above industry standard systems. It was, he made a net zero pledge. So there was, just a great deal of marketing out there that didn't reflect the reality. There was a tremendous gap between what the company was publicly saying in its annual report, its sustainability reports, press releases, AGM, in prospectuses and marketing material, that the company, that all portfolio managers on the active platform took ESG risk and opportunity factors into account. Again, the firm's ESG risk assessment systems were described as world-class, utilizing artificial intelligence. There were statements, the majority of the assets under management were ESG aligned. The reality internally was that this great, lauded externally lauded risk assessment system internally was the most commonly word used to describe the system was shit. There's a big difference between shit and world class. There was the majority of assets under management. They even put a number to this. Here I'm the chief sustainability officer. They put a number that 459 billion euros of assets under management are ESG aligned. There was no tracking system. Where did that number come from? The 13 most senior people got together to say, hang on a second, who made this statement? So we did a manual estimate internally. We couldn't do anything scientific because there were no tracking systems. And so we estimated that the real number was more like 150 billion. There was a 300 billion delta. This is significant. And at this point, ESG had become a material part of the firm's business. 40% of net new inflows coming into the platform, into the asset manager, was going into ESG strategies. So this is material. So I raised all these concerns to say, hang on a second.
Internally?
Internally, yep, to my CEO, to the board, to say, look, we are, we're regulated global. 25% of our AUM is in the United States, right? And we know the most fierce and feared financial watchdog is the SEC, right? We cannot be making these statements. We have no evidence. We cannot substantiate these statements. And in fact, the opposite. We have risk reports. We have internal email chains. You have all of my decks that actually tell the opposite story, that we're just embarking on our sustainability journey. And that's okay. We're not required to report on this just yet. So why put ourselves in jeopardy? Because we will trigger mis-selling, misrepresenting, misleading, statement rules. And, as was, rightly noted, I was just fired. And I was fired by post. Like, he didn't even have the balls to, meet up with me, or HR, to fire me in person. He hired a lawyer by the name of Mr. Anus. In my circles, we call him Mr. Asshole. Mr. Asshole wrote to me and said I was terminated. And there was a...
Can I just stop you for a moment?
Yeah.
So I want to understand. You raised it with the board. You raised it with the CEO. Did you go externally? Did you go to the media? Did you go to a regulator?
No.
And why not?
Because I had gone the internal routes, and as you can tell, I'm fairly outspoken. I'm fairly direct, and it's in writing. We're highly regulated, and by the way, it's Deutsche Bank. I mean, come on, it's constantly think of the most scandalous bank in the world. Deutsche Bank usually comes to mind. So we're also under a deferred prosecution agreement with Department of Justice, Eastern District. So you'd think, right? I'm on the record. There are board minutes. I am one of the most senior officials at the firm that this is going to be taken seriously. It wasn't. My last board meeting where I basically pounded the table to say we need to take immediate action here. It was about 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks later, I was fired. So they blindsided me. I didn't see it coming.
Right.
But the way I was fired, they just cut me off the platform. There was no, HR never got involved. There's no settlement agreement. There's no NDA. This lawyer just writes to me to say you're out. The Workers' Council also wrote to me to say this is a wrongful termination. And they called me up and they said, take action against the company. At the same time, this company, these fools, they went to the media first. So they thought that if they crush me, that will be the end of it. That they'll never hear about these greenwashing allegations. So they went to Bloomberg. They leaked a memo that said that I underperformed and I had questionable business ethics. And they also went to the immigration office and pulled my work permit. And during this time, this was COVID, I had no right to stay as a U.S. citizen. So I had to immediately leave. So they made me homeless, publicly discredited so I couldn't get another job. No severance, cut off from health insurance. As an American, this is one of the worst things in the world. I'm a single mother of 3. And at the age of 49, like a big loser, I have to go back to my parents' house and move into the basement with my kids. It was horrific, very disorienting. I didn't know what to do. And I didn't think about going to the authorities because I was based in Germany, and the BaFin, the financial regulator, is very compromised. It was definitely very compromised at the time, if you know the story of Wirecard, right? And Dan McCrum at the FT. This was the financial watchdog sided with Wirecard, against the market, against the Financial Times. So I knew that I couldn't go to this. There's no whistleblower protection. I couldn't go to the regulator. So as luck would have it, a friend of mine used to run a fairly well-known newspaper called the Wall Street Journal. And so I went to the Journal, and I met with a great team, and I handed over the documents. And even though you can see, like, I'm fairly passionate and emotional, actually, in this case, I wasn't. I really try to separate myself, and I usually try and help other whistleblowers, and that's a very important point to make, is like detach your situation. I had a coherent narrative about what had happened, what I suspected, and I had the documents, which I strongly believed backed my allegations. I made a timeline, because after I got fired, I did write. I had a 5-page dossier with links to other documents, and I sent it to the Mama Bank, to Deutsche Bank, to the president of Deutsche Bank, and to he was also in charge of the supervisory board of
Desiree,
DWS.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I know that you've got so much that we'd like to hear, but I'm afraid our time's almost up. So I'm going to ask you just to wrap up.
I will wrap it up. So all this happened. Going to the Wall Street Journal, the U.S. authorities called me up. The bombshell article came out. And to make a very long story short, it also piqued curiosity with the German police force. It culminated in May 2022 in a police raid. 50 federal agents raided Deutsche Bank's headquarters and DWS's headquarters. It eviscerated senior leadership at this company. And the SEC has just recently come in with a civil verdict, guilty, material greenwashing. So, and that verdict is out there. The criminal investigations, Department of Justice, FBI, and the German Federal Police and the prosecutor's office, those investigations are ongoing, but my allegations were validated by the SEC. And this is a case where now we can put a big fat price on greenwashing. This cost this company well over $1 billion. Market cap dropped by 14%. Senior leaders got fired. It cost them tens of millions in legal defense costs and untold lost client revenue. And this is the cautionary tale. So today, folks are a lot more cautious after the enforcement actions that happened here.
Well, thank you so much. That is quite the story. Thank you very much for sharing it with us all today. I think we might be out of time right? So no questions. Yeah, no, that's okay. Thank you very much to the panelists for their contributions. I know they've all got an awful lot more to say that's really interesting. So please catch anyone in the break afterwards at 6 o'clock. We'd all love to talk to you. Thank you very much.